My mother squeezed my hand under the table at my cousin's wedding, and I felt her press 3 fingers into my palm. 1, 2, 3. Slow and deliberate, the way she used to do it when I was 7 years old, and something was wrong, but she couldn't say it out loud. I hadn't felt that signal in over 20 years. My name is Leah, and I'm 32 years old. My mother has been widowed for 4 years, and last spring she married a man named Victor at a small courthouse ceremony that I wasn't invited to until 3 days before it happened. I smiled through the whole thing. I told myself I was happy for her. But the moment she pressed those 3 fingers into my palm at my cousin's wedding 6 weeks later, I understood that whatever was happening inside that marriage, it wasn't what she had told me it was. Let me go back to where this really started. My father died 4 years ago from a heart attack. He was 58 years old. He was the kind of man who fixed things without being asked, who remembered everyone's birthday, who could make my mother laugh so hard she'd have to put down her coffee. Losing him didn't break our family all at once. It happened the way water damage does, slowly, invisibly, until one day you press your hand to the wall and the whole thing gives. My mother, Patricia, handled grief the way she handled everything, quietly, with dignity, and mostly alone. She kept the house in Ohio. She kept her routine. She called me every Sunday at 9 in the morning and said she was fine, and I believed her because I wanted to. I was 28, newly engaged, building a life 2 states away in Chicago. I visited when I could, but I told myself she was strong, that she had her church group, her garden, her friends from the neighborhood. I told myself she wasn't lonely. But loneliness doesn't announce itself. It just moves in and rearranges the furniture so slowly that you stop noticing what's missing. About 18 months after my father died, my mother mentioned a man from her church group. His name was Victor. She described him the way you'd describe a reliable appliance: dependable, steady, there when you needed him. He had lost his wife 2 years prior. He brought food to shut-ins on Thursdays. He was a retired contractor, she said. He knew how to fix things. She said it almost as an afterthought. He reminds me of your father a little. That sentence lodged somewhere in my chest. Not painfully, just quietly, the way a splinter does before you realize it's there. The first time I met him was at Thanksgiving. My mother had invited him because, she said, he had no family nearby. He was pleasant, sturdy looking, mid-60s, with a firm handshake and a laugh that filled a room. He knew which teams my husband followed without being told. He asked me about my job in healthcare administration with what felt like genuine interest. He said my mother talked about me constantly. He said it with warmth, and I filed it away as a good sign. My husband Ben drove home that night and said simply, he tries hard. I said, what do you mean? Ben said, I mean he works at it. The laughing, the remembering things, he works at it. I said, isn't that a good thing? Ben didn't answer right away. Then he said, probably. I let it go. My mother had spent 2 years eating dinner alone and watching the news in an empty house. She deserved someone who tried. Over the next several months, Victor became a fixture. He drove her to appointments, he fixed the gutters, replaced the water heater, repainted the porch railing. My mother started sounding lighter on our Sunday calls. She laughed more easily. She mentioned wanting to travel, maybe the Pacific Northwest, maybe a cruise to Alaska. It felt like a door she had closed was opening again, just slightly, and light was coming through. Then the calls started getting shorter. At first, I thought it was just the busyness of a new relationship. She was spending more time with him, less time on the phone, and that was normal. But then there were Sundays where she didn't call at all, and when I called her, it went to voicemail. She'd text back an hour later, sorry, got distracted, talk soon. My mother had never been a texter. She considered it rude. Then one Sunday, a man's voice answered her phone. Victor said she was in the garden and hadn't heard it ring. He took a message. She called back later and said he was just being helpful. I said, it's fine. But I held the word helpful in my mind the same way you hold a coin from a foreign country, turning it over, not quite sure of its value. The wedding happened faster than any of us expected. My aunt found out from someone at church rather than from my mother directly. My mother told me on a Tuesday evening, almost as a passing detail. Victor and I decided to make it official. Saturday at the courthouse, just close family. It was Wednesday. I drove down with Ben on Friday night. The ceremony on Saturday was 15 minutes. My mother wore a blue dress I hadn't seen before. Victor wore a jacket that fit him well. He cried during the vows, not dramatically, just a few tears that he brushed away quickly, and something about the restraint of it felt almost practiced. Afterward, at lunch, he made a toast about second chances and how grateful he was to have found a woman with such a good heart. My aunt caught my eye across the table. My mother looked happy. That was the thing I kept coming back to. She looked genuinely happy. So I packed my hesitation into a box, thanked Victor for lunch, hugged my mother for a long time, and drove back to Chicago. That was February. By April, she had moved into his house. He owned a house in a suburb I'd never been to, newer, larger, in a subdivision where all the lawns looked identical. He called it a fresh start, a new chapter. My mother seemed excited about it when we talked. She sent photos of the kitchen, the garden she was planning, the sunroom where she'd set up her reading chair. But the calls kept getting shorter, and then less frequent, and then sometimes she'd go 4 or 5 days without answering at all. I called on a Wednesday in May and Victor answered again. He said she was resting. I said it was 3 in the afternoon. He said she'd had a headache and was lying down. He told me he'd let her know I called. She texted me that evening, "So sorry I missed you. Getting some rest, feeling better now. Love you." My mother doesn't say, "So sorry." She says, "Sorry I missed you." Small thing. But it's that wrong. The following Sunday, I finally reached her directly. Her voice was careful, measured in a way I hadn't heard before. She asked about Ben, about work, about the apartment. She didn't ask about herself. She didn't bring up anything from her own life. When I asked how Victor was, she said fine, and then said she had to go because they were about to have dinner and it was 5:30 in the afternoon. I mentioned to Ben that something felt off. He said, "Trust that." Then came my cousin's wedding in June. It was held at a venue about 40 minutes from my mother's new house, so she and Victor drove together and arrived early. I watched them walk in from across the room before they saw me. She was on his arm. She was smiling. She looked like my mother. Same hair, same posture. But something was different, and it took me a moment to place it. She was watching him, not looking around the room the way she usually would, not scanning for people she knew. She was tracking him, the way you watch someone you're not sure about. The reception was full and warm and loud. Victor was immediately in the middle of it, shaking hands, learning names, making people laugh. He had a gift for it, the kind of social ease that reads as charm until you watch long enough and realize it's actually precision. I found my mother near the dessert table and we hugged and she held on a moment longer than usual. That was the first thing I noticed. The second thing was that when I asked her how she was doing, really doing, she started to answer, and then Victor appeared at her elbow and answered for her. "She's wonderful," he said. "Aren't you, Patty?" He used a nickname no one in our family had ever used. "My mother's name is Patricia. My father called her Trish." She smiled and said yes. And then, as a relative came over to congratulate them and Victor turned his full attention to the conversation, my mother looked directly at me and pressed 3 fingers slowly into the back of my hand. 1, 2, 3. I did not react. I do not know how I managed it, but I did not react. My face stayed soft. I laughed at something someone said nearby and reached for a piece of wedding cake I didn't eat. That signal was ours and ours alone. My mother invented it when I was in second grade, during a period when my father traveled for work and she took me to events alone. She told me that if I was ever uncomfortable or scared, but couldn't say it out loud, at a family gathering, at a dentist appointment, anywhere, I should press her hand 3 times, and she would know. We only ever used it twice. Once when a neighbor's dog cornered me at a block party, and once when a man at a Christmas gathering made me feel uneasy in a way I couldn't name at age 9. She hadn't used it in 23 years, and now she was using it in a room full of family while her husband of 4 months stood 3 feet away making people laugh. I spent the rest of the reception performing normalcy. I danced with Ben. I talked to my aunt. I ate dinner and held a full conversation about landscaping with someone whose name I never caught. But the whole time I was watching. Victor did not let my mother out of his sight. It was disguised as attentiveness. A hand on her back, pulling out her chair, refilling her water glass. But when she excused herself to the restroom, he tracked the direction she walked. When my aunt asked her a question about the new house, Victor leaned in and answered before my mother had finished her first sentence. At one point, I was standing near the hallway, and my mother walked past to make a call. She stepped outside, and I followed her. She was standing near the door, phone in hand, but she wasn't dialing. She was just standing there. I said, "Mom?" She looked up fast, and for a fraction of a second, something crossed her face. Relief and fear at the same time, the way a person looks when they've been hoping for something and then are scared of what it means. She said quietly, "Not here." Before I could respond, I heard Victor's voice behind us. "Dare you to are." Easy smile. Hand on my mother's shoulder. He asked if everything was okay. I said, "Of course," and smiled back. At the end of the night, when we were saying goodbye in the parking lot, I hugged my mother and held on. She pressed her face into my shoulder, and I felt her exhale. A long, slow breath, like something she had been holding in for a while. Against my ear, barely audible, she said 4 words: "He controls the money." Then she stepped back, smiled for the people still nearby, and walked to the car. Ben and I drove home almost entirely in silence. Somewhere past the interstate exit, he reached over and took my hand and said, "Whatever she told you, we're going to fix it." I told him what she had said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All of it or just access?" I said I didn't know. He said, "Either way, it's a problem." Ben works in risk compliance at a financial services firm. He is methodical and careful and very hard to rattle. I have seen him receive bad news the way other people receive good news. Calmly, with interest, already thinking about what comes next. So when he said we needed to look into Victor before we did anything else, I trusted that process even though every instinct I had wanted to get in the car and drive back to Ohio that night. The next morning, while I was at work, Ben started pulling public records. He found that Victor had been married once before. Not to the wife he claimed had passed away, but to 2 different women in the prior 15 years in 2 different states. A divorce in Indiana in 2011. A death, his wife's, in Tennessee in 2016. Then a gap of several years, and then my mother. He found that the house Victor claimed to own had a mortgage that was significantly underwater, more than the house was worth. There were liens filed by 2 different contractors. His name appeared in a small claims case from 2019 involving a business dispute, and the judgment had gone against him. None of this was criminal on its face, but the pattern. The widows, the financial stress hidden behind a stable exterior. The quit marriage, Ben had seen versions of this in fraud cases. Targeting vulnerable people, building trust fast, integrating into the family before anyone could ask the right questions. He said he needed her assets, not her companionship. My mother owned a house outright, my father's life insurance, a modest retirement account, and a piece of land outside of Columbus that my father's family had held for 3 generations. To us, it was sentimental, but to someone who needed to restructure debt, it was also worth something real. I called my mother on a Tuesday and she answered on the first ring, which told me she was probably alone. Her voice was tight. She spoke quietly. I didn't ask leading questions, I just asked her to tell me what was happening, in whatever way she was comfortable with. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said he had told her the house, his house, needed to be refinanced and that her name needed to be on the mortgage to qualify. She had signed something a few weeks ago. She wasn't sure exactly what. He had explained it quickly and she hadn't wanted to seem suspicious. She said when she asked about it afterward, he told her she was being paranoid and that she needed to trust him. She said the word paranoid, the way people say a word that has been used against them so many times they've almost started to believe it. Then she said, he took my name off the joint checking account. He says he manages the finances better and I just get anxious about numbers. I asked about her own accounts, the ones she'd had before the marriage. Another silence. Then he said it made more sense to consolidate. I thought he was just being organized. Mom. I know. Her voice cracked once, just lightly. I know. I asked if she was safe, physically safe. She said yes, he had never touched her. The control was quieter than that. It was the account access, the answered phone calls, the explanations that made her feel foolish for asking questions, the constant soft insistence that he knew best, that she was lucky to have someone looking out for her after everything she'd been through. She said he says I owe him for everything he gave up to be with me. I said, you don't owe him anything. She didn't respond to that. I think she'd heard it said the other way for so long that my version hadn't fully landed. I told her I loved her and that I needed a few days and that she should act as normal as she could. She said she would try. That night, Ben and I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. We weren't impulsive about it. We thought about what we could actually do, what would hold up, what would protect her, and what would not make things worse before they got better. The first call we made was to a family law attorney in Ohio, a woman who specifically handled financial abuse cases within marriages. She explained our mother's options clearly. Ohio law provided protections for marital assets, and any transfers made under coercion could potentially be challenged. The signed refinancing document was a serious concern and needed to be reviewed. She told us to get a copy as soon as possible. The second call was to my mother's bank, the one where she'd had her personal savings account for 30 years, to understand what had actually changed and what documentation existed. The third thing we did was drive to Ohio on a Saturday morning without telling Victor we were coming. He answered the door with a smile. He said, "What a nice surprise. Come in." He was just about to make coffee. My mother appeared behind him in the hallway, and her eyes, when they met mine, did something complicated. Gratitude and apology at the same time. Ben asked to see the study, said he was curious about the home office setup. Victor took him there because declining would have been odd, and because men like Victor rarely feel threatened by other men who appear casual. That left me in the kitchen with my mother. I had maybe 5 minutes. I put the attorney's card on the counter and covered it with my hand and slid it toward her. I said her savings account had been flagged for a review. I was making that up, but it was enough. And that she needed to go into the branch in person this week, alone, and speak to the branch manager. I told her the attorney's name and said she could call from her car before she walked in. My mother looked at the card for a moment. Then she looked at me. She said, "He'll know. He'll know." I said, "He doesn't have to. You need a prescription refill. You're picking up something at the pharmacy. You go alone. You've always gone alone." She nodded once. Slowly, like someone remembering something she used to know about herself. When Victor and Ben came back into the kitchen, I was showing my mother a photo on my phone, a plant she'd asked about months ago, a kind of hosta that did well in shade. Victor looked at us, measured something, and then put his arm around my mother's shoulders and said we should all do dinner next time. He'd make us chili. We left an hour later. 4 days after that, my mother walked into her bank branch and asked to speak with someone about her account. The branch manager, a woman she'd known for 15 years, who had attended my parents' anniversary party once, who recognized her immediately, sat her down in a private office, closed the door, and let my mother talk. My mother talked for 45 minutes. By the time she was done, the manager had connected her to the bank's financial exploitation team, who in turn contacted an elder law specialist through a state resource network. Ohio has specific protections for financial exploitation of vulnerable adults, and my mother, as a recent widow who had been isolated and had signed documents she did not fully understand, qualified for several categories of assistance. The attorney we'd found moved quickly. The refinancing document my mother had signed was reviewed. Because she had not received independent legal counsel before signing and the terms had not been clearly explained, there were grounds to challenge it. The transfer of her personal savings to a joint account one to which she no longer had functional access, was documented as coercive. Victor received formal legal notice from the attorney on a Thursday morning. He called my mother 3 times in 2 hours. She didn't answer. He drove to the house, his own house, technically, and she was not there. She was at my aunt's. She had packed a bag 4 days earlier, the day after the bank visit, and left it in her car. Ben and I drove to Ohio that weekend. When we walked into my aunt's house, my mother was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea, wearing her own clothes, in a chair she had chosen herself. She looked tired, but she looked like herself. Something about the set of her jaw, the way her hands were loose in her lap, she looked like a woman who had remembered who she was. Victor contested the legal proceedings initially, but the documentation was significant. The account changes, the signed paperwork, the phone records showing his pattern of answering her calls, the pattern of 2 prior marriages to recently widowed women, one of whom, the widow in Tennessee, agreed to speak with an attorney after being contacted, and described circumstances almost identical to my mother's. 3 months later, my mother's marriage to Victor was annulled. He vacated the house. He did not fight for assets he legally had no claim to. He disappeared back into whatever version of his life existed before my mother, and I do not know where he went, but I know that 2 attorneys in 2 states now have documentation that follows his name. My mother moved back into her own house in Ohio, the house she and my father bought together in 1991, where the hydrangeas my father planted are now 20 years old and take up half the back fence. She painted the front door a shade of green she'd always wanted. She called me on a Sunday morning at 9 o'clock and talked for an hour. I asked her once, much later, why she hadn't told me sooner. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she had been embarrassed, not of him, of herself, for being lonely enough to miss the signs, for signing things she didn't read carefully, because she wanted to believe the kindness was real. She said, I didn't want you to think I was foolish. I told her I didn't think that. She said, I know, but I thought it about myself. That's the thing no one tells you about this kind of manipulation. It doesn't look like what you imagine. There's no dramatic moment where a person reveals themselves. It's just the slow accumulation of small decisions made for you, small freedoms quietly removed, small words repeated until you absorb them as truth. Paranoid, anxious, lucky to have someone. The person who was targeted isn't foolish. They're human, and they were hurting, and someone with practice found the exact right door. At Christmas that year, my mother sat at the head of the table in her own house and made the same roast she makes every year. After dinner, when everyone was clearing plates, she came up behind me at the sink and took my hand. She pressed it once, just once, quickly, and let go. Not a danger signal, just a hand held for a moment between a mother and a daughter, the way hands have always been held when words aren't quite enough. I keep coming back to the moment my mother said she didn't tell me sooner because she was ashamed of herself. Not of him, of herself. That's what this kind of thing does. It takes a person's own judgment and quietly turns it against them until the most painful part is in the situation but the belief that they should have known better. She did know better eventually. That's the part I want to hold on to. What Victor did don't work, not ultimately because of luck or accident. It unraveled because of a sequence of choices made by real people who refused to look away. My mother chose to use a signal she hadn't used in over 2 decades. She chose to trust that I would understand it without her having to say a word. That took courage, the kind that doesn't announce itself. She was frightened and isolated and had been told repeatedly that her instincts were wrong, and she still reached across that table and pressed her fingers into my hand. That is not the act of someone who failed to protect herself. That is the act of someone who found the last thread of herself and pulled. Ben chose to take it seriously from the first moment. He didn't tell me I was overreacting. He didn't suggest we wait and see. He understood that when someone you love signals danger quietly, the right response is quiet action, not drama, not accusation, just careful, steady, determined work. The branch manager, who had known my mother for 15 years, chose to close the door and listen rather than hand her a pamphlet and wish her well. The attorney chose to move quickly. Every one of those choices mattered. I think about causality a lot when I think about this story. Victor built his life on the assumption that isolated people stay isolated, that shame keeps people silent, that if you control the information, you control the outcome. He was right that shame is powerful. He underestimated what happens when love is more powerful than shame. The thing about integrity is that it operates even when no one is watching and no one is rewarding it. My mother had it. Ben had it. The bank manager had it. It's not a grand quality. It doesn't look like much in the moment. It looks like pressing three fingers into someone's hand. It looks like saying, trust that from the driver's seat on a dark highway. It looks like closing an office door and saying, take your time. What I want anyone to take from this is not that the system worked or that everything ended neatly, because it didn't for everyone. There's a woman in Tennessee whose story didn't have a Ben, didn't have a bank manager who'd known her for 15 years. Her story ended quietly, and she carried a loan for years before anyone asked. I think about her more than I probably should. What I want to say is pay attention. Not with suspicion, but with love and with clear eyes. Notice when someone sounds different. Notice when calls get shorter. Notice when a word like paranoid starts appearing in someone's vocabulary who never used it before. These things don't require certainty. They only require that you take them seriously enough to ask the next question. And if someone presses their hand against yours, in whatever way they know how, press back.